I'm very excited to be here with you today. Just so you know, the ideas that I'm drawing from are from my book, Disordered. If you're interested in any of these ideas or want to hear a little bit more about how I'm connecting them with race, check it out. This paper is entitled Dangerous Women and the Promise of Purity. There you go. So hopefully I will shock you just enough to make it interesting. All right. So sex isn't the only taboo for unmarried women, according to the Evangelical church in which my student grew up. The use of tampons and gynecological visits are also on the list of prohibited behaviors. According to this community, penetration of any kind, even by cotton or speculum, diminishes a woman's virginity. While many of us would consider the prohibition of tampon use and medical appointments as extreme, the impetus behind these rules is all too familiar within evangelical circles. Purity culture, which gained popularity in the 1990s, is a Christian evangelical movement focused on promoting abstinence prior to marriage. I'm sure if some of you grew up in evangelical churches like I did, you are well aware of this. It pursues teaching this end by instructing young women in lessons like every time you have a sexual encounter outside of marriage, you give part of yourself away, rendering yourself incomplete when you become sexually intimate with your husband. In this way, the gift of self communicated in the sexual encounter with one's spouse is diminished and depreciated. Young men, on the other hand, tend to be given a different sort of lesson, one that speaks to the importance of guarding against their natural inclination toward the sin of lust, which purportedly courses more strongly within them than it does their female counterparts. They're taught that only by staving off such impure impulses can they remain strong men of faith. Now, while for both parties, the goal is sexual abstinence, the underlying message given as to why one should abstain is notably distinct, as is the response to instances of transgression. Now, while this difference in attitude can be attributed to cultural, boys will be boys type factors, there are underlying ecclesial and theological aspects that should be considered as well. What are the theological factors that have led to the church's seemingly heightened investment in the embodiment of women? What makes women's bodily functions and conduct of particular interest to the church? Now, one might raise a similar question about evangelical attitudes around abortion. And here I know I'm opening a can of worms, so there we go. So according to a Pew Research survey from March 22, 74% of white evangelicals believe that abortion should be illegal in all or most cases and are twice as likely as the average American and more likely than any other religious group to support abortion bans. Acknowledging the religious roots of their conviction, it is possible that this level of support is the result of a deeply held belief in the sanctity of life, especially the life of a vulnerable child. It is curious, however, that such a conviction does not extend to other areas of life, to child-related social services, the death penalty, or even the availability of guns, which is now the leading cause of child mortality in the United States. The tension between these positions creates space to question whether there might be other factors impacting this unique level of concern over abortion. It is perhaps an unspoken truth that the litmus test for whether one is a true Christian within evangelical circles, at least the ones I grew up in, can be distilled to three issues: sex, sexuality, and abortion. Now that I've perhaps unwisely opened this paper with two of the three, I would like to clarify one thing. The point that I'm raising here is not whether or not there's a valid theological argument for abstinence or against abortion. Stanley Hauerwas, for instance, provides a really beautiful pro-life argument based on the call of Christian community. Rather, the question I'm posing is this: might there be something deeper driving the evangelical discourse around sexual purity and abortion? The church has long demonstrated particular interest in the bodies and embodiment of certain people, women being among them. What drives this attentiveness to bodies? While the commonly articulated values of purity and life are certainly present in evangelical Christianity, I suspect that beneath these convictions is a more fundamental concern, that of proper order. The story being told is that God has established a holy order according to which Christians are to live, and that certain people, including women, pose a threat to this order of things. Now, let me explain. Now, even before we get to the theological writings of the disorderly nature of women, we find the idea of inherent female inferiority present within Greek philosophy. Most of us have heard this before, right? Rooted in the belief that the woman lacks the active heat necessary to form life, Aristotle concludes that when it comes to the reproductive formation of a child in utero, it is the man alone who contributes the soul, or logos, that gives shape to the unformed material substance that the woman passively provides. So basically, the woman's providing the material substance, the man is providing the means of formation. The man's active power, quote, as the proximate motive cause to which belong the logos and the form, is better and more divine in its nature than the matter. That is why, wherever possible and so far as possible, the male is separate from the female, since it is something better and more divine in that it is the principle of movement for generated things, while the female serves as their matter, unquote. Aristotle's contention that the active power of the male is not only better, but more divine is rooted in the fact that the divinity of the first principle provided by the man is the logos. And the logos is tied to the rational soul of the man as well as the rationality of divinity. Now here we're talking about, right, the very concept of God as logos, as reason, right? Here in Aristotle's writing, we see an early instantiation of what will later become a well-established trope concerning men and women, namely that men are marked by a natural rationality, and in this case, a kind of transcendent reason that is unavailable to women. Women instead are characterized by an irrationality tied to their embodiment. They are governed by the baser principles of their emotions and instincts, rooted in their connection with the material world and their bodies. Now, these Greek philosophical ideas are easily adapted by Christian theologians. Augustine of Hippo, for instance, claims that because God is logos, or reason, it follows that the human bears the image of God through holy contemplation, an activity rooted in the mind-soul. Such contemplative activity is our human reason seeking the reason that is God, our logos seeking the great logos. What is notable about Augustine's conception of the Imago Dei, however, is that he does not believe that both men and women manifest the image of God to the same degree. Men are more rational than women, and therefore bear the image of God more thoroughly. He writes, "The woman together with her husband is the image of God, so that the whole substance is one image. But when she is assigned as a helpmate, a function that pertains to her alone, then she is not the image of God. But as far as the man is concerned, he is by himself alone the image of God, just as fully and completely as when he and the woman are joined together as one." It is because of men's natural rationality, which stands over against women's embodied irrationality, that they are able to image God apart from women. But women must be joined with the man to image God. Men are simply more aligned with this holy, rational, and transcendent order of God. Now, by the medieval period, this picture of women as less rational, less transcendent, and therefore less compatible with the divine oikonomia, or order that is God's holy plan, right, has plenty of time to take hold. Stories of women's diminished rationality and materially bound existence has been rehearsed in biological, philosophical, and theological spheres. In the Summa, Thomas Aquinas reiterates Aristotle's argument that it is because of the woman's, quote, defective and misbegotten, unquote, nature that she contributes nothing formative in the reproductive process. So basically, he's borrowing directly from Aristotle here. It is the male seed alone that provides the active power necessary to give shape to the unborn child. Given the superior nature of active to passive, quote, the male seed tends to the production of a perfect likeness in the masculine sex, while the production of a woman comes from defect in the active power, unquote. But simply, when the active power is sufficient, the baby is born a boy. When the active power is insufficient, the baby is born a girl. Now, even if we accept that this view of the female sex as deficient is limited to the biological process, we are nonetheless left with the fact that women are thought to lack the necessary active power because they lack this sufficient logos rationality. It is, after all, the rational soul within men that allows them to exercise the active power that imparts form to this material substance that becomes a child. And if the woman lacks this rational logos or manifests it in a diminished form, what does that say about her capacity to commune with or image God? Right? Especially if we're working from the substantive view of the Imago Dei. Now, much like Augustine, Aquinas sees the soul as the incorporeal site of human intellect. It both corresponds with the body and is superior to it. This correspondence of the soul to the body is akin to a kind of reflection. The body reflects the state of the soul. Such a correspondence helps explain Aquinas' belief in female deficiency. He writes, it is necessary for the soul to be proportioned to the body as form to matter, and as the mover to the moved, and therefore woman, even as to her soul, was more imperfect than man. In short, the inferior state of the woman's soul corresponds with the deficiencies of her body, and the deficiencies of her body provide insight into the deficiencies of her soul. The incompletion of the woman is not only physical, but also spiritual. Right? Aquinas gestures toward the corresponding nature of spirit and body. And this is reflected in an established sense within medieval thought that spiritual order is not simply an internal condition impacting the moral, intellectual, and emotional realms. It is also manifest externally in the form and the function of the body. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So for women, just in case it wasn't already interesting. So for women, such logic is used to explain the female menstrual cycle. As daughters of Eve, all women bear the spiritual consequences of the first woman's disobedience. While both Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it was Eve who spoke to the serpent, an animal symbolically associated with bestial and demonic order. It was Eve who first submitted to temptation, eating of the tree of knowledge. And as 1 Timothy puts it, quote, Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Now, according to this reading of Genesis 3, Adam's sin is subsequent and secondary to that of Eve. It is Eve who is the primary cause of the fall. It is Eve who rejects the proper order that God gifts the humans, and doing so submits herself to the serpent's bestial disorder. In this act of disobedience, the woman privileges her material and carnal desires over the rational and spiritual directive of God. She elevates the serpent's instability and falsehood above divine form and truth, thereby choosing for herself a less transcendent, less rational, and more animalistic, materially bound existence. This ontological deformation that occurs within Eve is then passed down from generation to generation, from mother to daughter, such that all women now bear the consequence of her disobedience. Choosing guttural desire over divine rationality, some medieval texts go so far as to suggest that it is because of Eve that women no longer bear the image of God at all. Instead, theirs is the imago of the wild beast. Remember, the serpent being a sign of bestial and demonic disorder. It is for this reason that men are judged naturally superior to women in both spirit and mind. Now, as previously noted, this lapsarian corruption inherited from Eve does more than impact the nature of the woman's intellectual and spiritual state. It alters her physiology as well. According to medieval medical thought, the body is ruled by humors, right? Consisting of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, which are themselves connected with elemental qualities of cold, hot, moist, and dry. Now, in order to maintain bodily health, all four humors must be kept in proper balance. They must be rightly ordered. However, the spiritual corruption that the woman inherits from Eve leaves her in a state of perpetual humoral imbalance, resulting in an excessively moist and cold complexion. The consequence of this imbalance is twofold. First, the woman's inordinately moist and cold complexion leaves her sexually dissatisfied. Her desire burns like damp wood, continuing to smolder in search of gratification. And as a result, the medieval Christian woman is believed to be more inclined towards sexual infidelity than the average Christian man. Women are believed to be so prone to sexual sin that when men engage in inappropriate sexual behavior, they are said to, quote, turn away from higher things and to become like a woman, bound to the body, unquote. A temptress by nature, Albert the Great describes the woman as a venomous serpent and nothing but a devil fashioned into a human appearance. This connection that Albert makes between women and the serpent of Genesis 3 is, of course, not uncommon in medieval writings. After all, not only is Eve tempted by the serpent, but then she takes on the role of the serpent when she in turn lures Adam into disobedience. According to this logic, there are artistic renderings of the biblical event of the fall from this period that actually portray the serpent with the body of a snake and the head of a woman. Just as Adam should have been wary of Eve, who lured him into disobedience, so too should Christian men exercise caution around women. In addition to the woman's tendency towards sexual depravity, her humoral imbalance prompts an accumulation of toxins in her body. So this is the second consequence. This noxious buildup produces both emotional and physical consequences, including mania and leprosy. Right, the woman's body must rid itself of these toxins on a regular basis through monthly menstruation if she is to avoid these illnesses. As such, menses is a consequence of the first woman's spiritual corruption and a sign of female fallenness. All right, you ready for it to get even more interesting? All right, here we go. Women are not the only ones thought to fall victim to spiritual corruption that attends embracing bestial and demonic disorder and eschewing God's intended order. Nor, interestingly enough, are they the only ones to suffer the physiological consequences of menstruation. Medieval texts suggest that Jews and heretics are also afflicted by the same external manifestation of internal corruption. As historian Sanders Gilman writes, quote, male Jews menstruated as a mark of the father's curse, their pathological difference being a result of their original denial of Christ. Right? Denying Christ, rejecting Christ is a denial of God's holy order, right? God's divine plan, just like Eve rejected God's holy order, right? Fittingly, this bloody fate that attends the spiritually disordered Jew and heretic parallels the fate of another traitor, namely Judas Iscariot. According to the book of Acts, upon hanging himself, Judas's intestines spill out of his body. Commentaries from late antiquity augment this biblical description with the claim that at his death, his soul exits his body by way of his anus. Like both Jews and heretics, Judas's rejection of Christ is what triggers his gruesome fate. To reject Christ is to reject God's divine economy, right? To embrace its opposite. And it's to embrace the devil's demonic disorder. For just as the devil is thought to enter the body by way of the anus, this is medieval thinking, right? The soul of the deceitful and spiritually corrupt is believed to leave the body likewise. Thus, anal retribution is the fate of all who reject or betray God's divine economy. Now, by claiming that male menstruation is the natural consequence of choosing spiritual disorder over God's divine order or God's divine ways, medieval writers reinforce the narrative of women's inherent disorderliness. For according to this logic, almost all women bear the physiological marks of their inherent spiritual corruption, right? If you have a period, you're spiritually corrupt. So not only do women suffer the consequence of this corruption themselves, their natural disorder is also believed to be contagious. In fact, medieval medical texts advise Christian men to avoid sexual contact with women during menses, lest they be tainted by female fallenness. If intercourse does occur, the toxicity of the woman's menstrual blood risks contaminating the man's proper spiritual order, thereby altering his own humoral imbalance and resulting in bodily sickness such as leprosy. Men should take care when engaging women in a state of impurity. The same dangers of physical exposure also apply to children born to menstruating mothers. It is believed that a newborn can contract a congenital disease through contact with menses at the time of their birth. Now, while the science may now strike us as suspect on a number of levels, the lesson being communicated at this time was pretty clear. A person's internal state is manifest externally. And one can see this clearly in the case of women, for all women have inherited this spiritual corruption from Eve. Women now bear the consequence of the spiritual affliction, not only in their natural, mental, moral, and emotional states, but also in their physical bodies. Whether by way of leprosy or monthly menstruation, the body reveals the truth of the woman's waywardness. What's more, her inherent corruption is contagious. Others can be infected through contact with the physical manifestations of her disorder. Now, this last claim concerning the infectious nature of the woman's disorder is sociopolitically significant. For within the context of Christendom, a society organized around what is perceived to be the divine order of God, good citizenship is determined by the extent to which one lives in accordance with the divine economy, with God's holy order. It follows that those believed to manifest a dissonant order are also thought to pose a real threat to the function and the future of Christian society. This is even more so in the case of women, since they are thought to so easily pass their disorder on to others, threatening the proper order of others. In this way, women endanger the whole of civilized Christian society, right? So basically, if it is true to say that women's disorderliness is contagious, right? And that to be a good citizen means that you live according to the proper order of God, then the contagiousness of women itself existentially threatens Christendom, right? God's proper Christian society. Now, of course, this assessment of risk is not limited to women. It applies to non-Christians and heretics as well. They too embody the same type of spiritual disorder that threatens Christendom's health and flourishing. The difference, however, is that while it is possible during the Middle Ages to remove Jews, Moors, and heretics from the body politic through edicts of expulsion, inquisition, and exile, the solution is not so simple when it comes to Christian women. As bearers of Christian boys who will one day become faithful Christian men and good citizens, women are indispensable. What do we do about the women? The solution when it comes to Christian women cannot be expulsion or extermination. Instead, female waywardness must be reformed. Women of faith must be encouraged to cultivate control over their bodily bound corruption and disorderliness so as to bring themselves into greater alignment with God's proper order. And men of faith must provide the guidance to aid them in this endeavor. Despite women's natural state of corruption, medieval thinkers nonetheless recognized that biology is not destiny. Even for Aquinas, with his views of female inferiority, there are exceptions to the rule. It is possible for a woman to transcend her bestial corruption so as to attain a higher state of existence. We see examples of this transcendence in hagiographies of female saints, for instance, wherein they prove that they are not bound to the body but are spiritually pure. Physical virginity is, of course, one way of indicating such purity, but is perhaps even more profoundly displayed in their transcendence of the common nature of the flesh, as one observes in the patristic hagiography of Macrina, for instance. Gregory of Nyssa's telling of this suggests that the transformation of Macrina's flesh is an indication of how thoroughly she has been sanctified. One observes a similar theme of bodily transformation in hagiographies of the female saints from the Middle Ages. To a greater extent, and I thought this was really fascinating, to a greater extent than their male counterparts, these hagiographies of holy women in the Middle Ages are said to undertake spiritual practices focused on taming the physical needs of the body, such as absolute abstinence from food, right? So more so than their male counterparts, right? The miracles that they perform, like the real radical transformation that they undergo, is physically oriented, right? Absence from food, absence from water. They're also more likely to experience the gift of the stigmata as their own bodies are brought into conformity with that of our crucified Lord. This, of course, can be said of female saints, but what of the typical Christian woman, one who has not taken monastic vows, but still desires to live faithfully? What kind of path to purity is available to her? After all, it is the purity of the laywoman that is of greatest consequence to Christian society. For not only do such women have the ability to corrupt Christian men, but their reproductive role is essential to its future. Christian society's anxious preoccupation over women's purity can be observed in a reoccurring medieval motif of the faithful Christian woman who encounters a non-Christian man, typically not white European, who threatens her sexual purity and spiritual purity. Right? It can also be observed in the cautionary tale of women who, due to their own spiritual weakness, allow themselves to think upon impure things in the middle of inception or birth, and as a result, bear a child that is either Black, deformed, or demonic. Now, in both of these stories, that of the non-Christian outsider and that of the Christian woman who distorts her own child through her lack of self-discipline, the lesson communicated is the importance of protecting female purity, both physical and spiritual, in order to safeguard reproductive outcomes. What we observe in these stories is more than a lust for control and power. Such a reading would be too simplistic, I think. Instead, the undergirding sentiment is fear, namely fear of societal disorder, fueled by the desire to preserve what is believed to be God's intended social order. Now, this is an important point that I feel like we shouldn't miss. While it is easy to interpret Christianity's history of control over women's bodies as simply a byproduct of patriarchal grasping, a more textured reading suggests that the rules and regulations applied to female embodiment is in fact the byproduct of a genuine desire to be faithful. For many demands of purity applied to young girls, and even the punitive approaches to regulating women's bodies come from a place of deep conviction and best intentions, perhaps even from the desire for all people to know the blessings of a life properly ordered before God. But herein lies the real question. What if the order we believe to be of God is more a reflection of our own human culture than the divine reality? What if the order of God is radically different than the rules and regulations that we've been given? Scripture is replete with examples of people believing themselves to be living according to the order of God and being taught otherwise. We see this in Peter's vision of the blanket of unclean food lowered before him and his subsequent meeting with the Gentile Cornelius. Right? Through these encounters, the apostle learns that what he once thought to be God's intended order, namely the separation of the clean from the unclean, the Jew from the Gentile, is contrary to the divine order intended by God. We see this again in the life of Jesus as he regularly challenges the given societal and religious norms believed to be aligned with God's holy order. Healing on the Sabbath, touching the sick, speaking with a Samaritan woman, even healing a hemorrhaging woman who is rendered unclean by her constant bleeding. Each of these examples offers insight into how proper religious and social order is undermined by Christ and his actions. Now, in this last instance, we are told in the book of Mark that the woman has suffered constant bleeding for 12 years, right? A state that would have left her perpetually impure and in turn precluded her from full participation within properly ordered society for more than a decade. Given her marginal and contaminated status, it is noteworthy, right, when Jesus encounters her, that he does not grow angry, right? He does not call for her removal from the gathered crowd, as would be correct according to Levitical rules for female discharge of blood. He does not concern himself with the threat to individual purity or societal order that her bodily dysfunction poses. Instead, Jesus makes a point of stopping in the view of the entire crowd gathered around him to inquire who has touched his cloak. In choosing to see and encounter this woman in this visible way, he publicly challenges the exclusionary practices rooted in what was thought to be proper, divinely ordained societal order. Whether by associating with the prostitute or forgoing traditional washing rituals, Jesus regularly disregards the established purity practices of his day, and by doing so undermines a system of proper order to which they belong. Throughout Scripture, God undermines our efforts to protect ourselves, to protect Christianity, and to protect the future of the kingdom through methods of exclusion and control predicated upon our own mistaken conceptions of proper order. Saying no to our definition of right order, drawn from our reading of the law, Jesus reveals and invites us into the truth of God's divine oikonomia. This holy economy into which Jesus calls us is not built upon stringent rules, rigid boundaries, exclusionary practices, or feelings of fear and shame, but upon the divine relational economy of the triune God who is always with and for the other. The economy of God is marked by the relational way of being with and for the other, because God, in and of God's self as immanent Trinity, is with and for the other. As the second person of the Trinity, God in Christ takes on the fullness of our humanity, choosing to dwell among us and thereby bridging the ontological gulf between finite and infinite. By taking the materiality of our bodily flesh, God reveals God's self to be pro nobis for us. It is this very order, this way of being with and for the other, that Jesus manifests in his own life, that he teaches his followers, and that even marks the space of his body. This is my body broken for you. Jesus offers to us the holy order of God because Jesus is the holy order of God. But this, of course, is not only who God is for us. As Dietrich Bonhoeffer notes, this way of being with and for the other, this way of ordering God's self in relation to the world, is the relational order into which we too are called. This holy relationality that we are being asked to embody transgresses the limits that otherwise separate us from one another. In Christ, this looks like crossing ontological, religious, and societal boundaries in order to live out the divine relational economy. In humanity, this looks like transgressive participation in the divine economy, such that there is no longer a hierarchical division of male and female, Jew and Gentile, slave and free. While particularity and diversity remain good aspects of our created state, the judgment, hostility, and fear that can separate us according to gender, ethnicity, race, and socioeconomic status are rendered moot within Christ, that is to say, within the righteous order of the kingdom. Within the space of Christ's body marked by this alternative relationality, purity is no longer to be understood as strict adherence to a set of ethical rules or rigorous maintenance of exclusionary boundaries. No longer is righteousness before God determined by whether or not we follow specific purity laws. As the book of Hebrews tells us, with the sacrifice of Christ, the law has come to be written upon our hearts and minds. Rather than from strict adherence to certain rules and regulations, purity now stems from our even deeper transgressive participation in the divine economy that defines Christ's body, bringing ourselves and our ways into accordance with the relational rhythms of God. Thus understood, our strivings after purity and proper order are shown to be small and petty in light of the sacred relational logic of the divine. Let me say that one more time. Our strivings are shown to be small and petty in light of the sacred relational logic of the divine. The church has long concerned itself with the purity of women's bodies and bodily practices out of, I would say, a praiseworthy desire to safeguard the Christian community from corruption. We have taught women that in order to remain righteous and aligned with the ways of God, their bodies and embodiment must be strictly controlled, both through their own self-disciplinary practices and the disciplinary actions of others. To be a people ordered in accordance with God's will does not require the evaluative categorization, control, or exclusion of that which we have deemed disorderly or impure. That's at least what I'm proposing here. It does not require constant policing of boundaries and bodies, whether our own or those of others. The Spirit of Pentecost reveals to us that the kingdom is not realized through exclusionary methods intended to maintain a distinction between holy and unholy, pure and impure. Instead of the careful policing of boundaries, what we see is that the community of God is constituted through a spirit-filled, open-handed transgression of the given limits of belonging. In this case, we're talking about land and language, right, with Pentecost. But this transgression that makes room for new encounters It is through such unexpected and uncontrollable encounters that God creates something radically different and even more expansive than what has gone before. This is the holy order of God, this way of being with and for those who are different from ourselves, with and for those we once thought strangers, with and for those we once imagined to be impure. Our job is not to preserve and to control, but to remain open as we are drawn further into the radically transgressive order of God, and through such participation, transformed accordingly. And in such transformation, God reveals to us a more profound way of being, a more profound way of connecting, and a more profound way of embodying purity. Thanks.